So now we're going to sew the front panels on, and I'm going to use the one where I marked the front notch here. That's going to be my right side, and that means the right side goes down on top of the right side of the yoke here. Okay, so right sides together, right side,
And the armholes.
and what we're going to do though, because again these three seams, the yoke seams and the front seam, have to be in between these two layers. So to begin with, we're only sewing the top yoke onto the front piece. So you can just fold that other one, the inside one, out of the way, and we're going to line these up at 1 centimeter, and then make sure they match at the end. And every time you're sewing, like, don't just put these ends together and then just start sewing and see what happens at the other end. You know, you really have to
Check how it's lining up.
line everything. Make sure that your raw edges together all the way. Okay, so those together at 1 centimeter. And now this is the other side. So this is my right side where I've marked the notch. So I'm facing that down. And you can see here, this is an armhole and this is an armhole. So obviously they're going to go together, whereas this is a neckline, that's the front edge. So if you're doing something like this, you know that that's wrong, because there's no way that bit and this bit here can be an armhole. Okay, so just, lay everything up on the table if you need to. Go back and forwards, that's not a problem.
So Mark's lining up the front, where he's starting, he's having a look at the end to see that it matches.
And using my fingers to make sure this is, because this shoulder goes slightly onto the bias, it can pull and stretch a little bit. So just make sure that you've got, that's why you need to make sure your raw edges are matched up. Oop.
Just show everyone the flow through, Mark.
Yeah.
When you hear us talk about the flow through,
So
see how those edges are complete. It just flows seamlessly on.
Yeah. And the same on the neckline as well.
No little steps.
You don't want any steps. Particularly important around the neck hole, because you only have a 6 millimeter seam allowance, and if you've got this off 2 millimeters, then you've already lost a third of your seam allowance around the neck. So it makes sewing the collar onto it really tricky. Okay, so now this is probably, this seems very tricky, but everybody can do it. It's actually not. It sort of makes sense. So what we need to do is we need to have these 3 seam allowances in between these 2 pieces when we sew them. We can't do that because that means that seam allowance will be on the inside of the garment. So what we have to do is hold this up, so you've got the 3, this is our back yoke seam here, our single our yoke pieces, and so we need to twist this around so that the shirt, the main part of the shirt, is in between these 2 layers. Okay, and now because we want to use this line here as our guide, we can't actually, in this instance we probably could use it because we can see through, we can see the black thread, but when you're doing a real thing and you're working in a matching thread, it's a bit trickier. So we want to line these edges up, and then we're going to flip over to this side, and we're going to make sure that it matches at the neck here. Okay, and like we did on the back yoke there, we're using our first row of stitching as a guide to sew these 3 layers together.
So this technique's called bagging out. We're bagging out the seam so that we don't see the seam allowance.
Okay, so we've got all of our seams, visible together, and then the bulk on the inside. And then what we can do, this is the fun bit, is pull this out, and you can see, so this is the right side of the garment. Oh, I can actually see a bit of my first row of stitching there.
But if it's in the right thread colour, you wouldn't notice that. It's
No,
on the
that's
inside,
true.
is it?
Oh, actually, this is the outside here, the
Yeah,
right
that's the
side. So
outside,
yeah,
yeah.
so you can't see that, so it's all nice and neat there. So that's one side done.
Seems like magic. I always find this confusing, bagging out. So sometimes to get my head around it, I'll just fold the seam allowance in and just pop a pin the way I want it to look at the end and then work backwards. So
Yeah,
I know
so
that seems crazy to you, Mark, probably, but
no.
I
So
get
you do it like
confused
this
with
because you need these seam allowances
Yeah, so
inside
put it how
here.
you want it to look.
So fold that
And then
out
hold on
and
to
then
that.
hold on to that.
Yeah.
Although you probably would be better doing it on this side because that's a little hole. This is
Yeah.
a bigger hole here. So yeah, so fold this around.
Yeah,
We
put
want
it
that to
how-
go in
yeah.
there.
And then
we'll
you've got to
pull
get
it
it
through.
out and
Yeah, so
Yeah.
yes, let's do that. So we'll put that there.
pop a pin in there if you want to hold it so you don't lose it.
Because we're not actually, even though we're joining together at this piece, we actually want to start sewing from the
Yeah.
other end.
This side's a little bit harder, so because it's not as free. Gets easier the more times you do it.
Yeah, but you can see there, see our
Yeah,
3 layers
yeah.
together. So now I'm going to put this underneath the foot, and once it's under the foot, I'm just going to, so I'm getting it into my starting position there, which is good. And then just getting these layers
Getting that pin out.
lined up, taking the pin out, exactly. So if this isn't making sense, just come and grab one of
Yeah,
us. And
yeah, sometimes it's easier when you get shown.
and the trick is to, that's why the pin's a good idea, because sometimes you get it in a position,
Yeah.
you know, you ask somebody, you get it in a position, and by the time you've gone back to the sewing machine, it's come apart and you're
Yeah.
back to base one again. These threads are very long and annoying. Okay, so then we just need to pull this out.
It's magic.
And we have a double yoke with no seam allowances visible, which is nice because it means that you don't have to do, there's no overlocking, you don't have to do French seams or anything like that. And it also too, what's nice about this is that it gives you, the yoke gives you a nice place. If you were going to put a label, you'd actually sew your label onto this piece first before you started sewing the pieces together, and that means that the label gets sewn on just to the inside layer so you don't see the stitching on the outside layer. So we've got our yoke here. What we're going to do now is we're just going to top stitch the yoke to give it a nice neat finish. You don't, I find I usually don't iron this at this stage, just sort of like, you know, give the, as you're sewing, you can just give it a little bit of a pull, and the top stitching does a lot of the pressing for you.
And you're doing it on the outside of the garment, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. So this is the outside or the good side of the fabric. Scoot along, and we're sewing through all of these layers here. So we've got what? There'd be 2, 3, 1, 5 layers of fabric we're sewing through here, and it's keeping all of those layers nice and tight and together.
And you'll often see top stitching on a yoke like this. It can either be on the edge or it can be, you know, 5 or 6 mil in.
And you can see it there, it really is quite close to the edge. And just keeping all of that. And what we're going to do, continue this line of stitching around, and for the armhole we've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance here. So just to hold these 2 layers together, it'll help you when you're coming to sew the sleeve in.
So you're keeping that inside the 1 centimetre.
Yeah, exactly. So when you stitch the seam, this is inside, so you don't see it on the outside of the garment. And then the other thing too is that when you come to a corner, you can, you know, lift the foot up with your knee so that gets up, and then turn everything around and then bring it down again on the other side. And this stitching is actually not quite as close to the edge as I want it to be. So I'm lifting up the foot, I've taken the needle out, I've lifted up the foot, repositioned the fabric underneath, and just brought that needle down where I want it to be. Now, with this, with the neckline here, what I'm going to do is just put a pin in to match up my centre back notches here. And with the neckline, we only have a 6mm seam allowance. So we're going to sew the two layers together. We're just going to make sure that we've actually got them inside that 6mm. So we can't sew it so close to the edge that the stitching's going to fall off. But we just want, and this is so that when we sew the collar on, you're not seeing this row of stitching on the outside of the garment. And then when we get back up to the seam again, I'm just going to wriggle that over a little bit and then go down here and then turn the corner and then just hold these pieces together too. Actually, I probably didn't need to back tack at the end there because this is going to be encased anyway. But you can see then I've got the top stitching and I've got my open bits held together as well.